Hello, and a very warm welcome to today's Global Strategy Forum event. It's the first of the ad hoc events that I promised our members and guests back in December when we ended our regular monthly program, and it's very good, if I may say so, to see so many of you here today. I'm particularly delighted that for this first lunchtime event of 2024, our speaker is General Sir Richard Barrons. He, of course, had a most distinguished military career, but he's also one of GSF's board members, whose advice over the years has been invaluable to me. He will be talking to us today about his new autobiography, which is fittingly entitled War and Peace, The Life and Times of Sir Richard Barrons. It is both a personal memoir and an astute appraisal of military leadership and strategy, including the evolving role of technology in warfare. You may well remember the excellent series of articles which he wrote for GSF during the pandemic, which we subsequently published as a compendium. And I'm told his autobiography contains more of the same trenchant, hard-hitting analysis, as well as his personal reflections on his career and his experiences in the army. I say I'm told because we were so eager to get Richard to speak on his book that it turns out that the date we agreed upon with him is in fact 2 weeks before the actual date of the book's publication, on the 30th of May. However, Primrose Hill Books, who are here today, have managed to work wonders, and we do have some copies available for you to buy today, which I'm sure Richard will gladly sign after the meeting. For any of you who have pre-ordered, as we originally suggested, we have book plates, which he has agreed to sign for you as well. I'm also delighted to welcome today to GSF the award-winning journalist Manveen Rana, who many of you will know from daily news podcast she currently hosts for The Times and The Sunday Times, The Story, as well as from her previous career as a reporter for the BBC Today programme and the reputation she has for powerful investigative reporting. She's going to introduce Richard more fully, and she will give some of the background to the writing of the book before discussing it with Richard for about 25 minutes, and then she will open it up to the floor for question and answer, which she'll also chair until, as I've informed her, 2 p.m, when, as usual, we will promptly end. So without further ado, Manveen and Richard, over to you.
It's such a pleasure to be able to welcome our guest of honour today, General Sir Richard Barrons. As Michael was just saying, in a long and distinguished career in the military. He served in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Afghanistan and Iraq. Between 2013 and 2016, he was Commander Joint Forces Command, where he had a reputation for being an innovator and one of the visionaries who really shaped thinking on how technology is changing the future of warfare. As a sign of how well regarded he is in the military, it's not often that contemporaries and competitors sort of heap praise on you, and if they do, it's usually through gritted teeth. But as the former Chief of the Defence Staff, General Sir Nick Carter, always says of Richard, he was the cleverest officer of his generation. And for those of you who spend a lot of time on social media, you'll also know him for his recent viral appearance when a speech he gave on Ukraine became the thing that Gen Z were passing around between themselves. So if you haven't seen it yet, do look it up. People queue up to hear Richard's insights on defence. But what many of you probably won't know is that he's also hilariously funny and a brilliant writer, which is very ably highlighted by this book, War and Peace, the more readable version, The Life and Times of General Sir Richard Barrons. I will come round to questions from all of you. But before we do, Richard, do you want to explain how this book came about?
Well, I'm already really squirming. I mean, although, I am my favourite subject, it's quite difficult to talk about it. So why did I write this book? Well, first of all, there was a pandemic, and I was clearly had time on my hands. That mattered. Secondly, because I really can't type, I discovered I could talk to my computer and dictate it. So it became possible rather than just too annoying to contemplate. And then, thirdly, I was wrestling with two things. One was what I will, again, laughingly refer to as my military career had finished. And that had covered an interesting period of time for me. But I still harbored a sense of disappointment, partly because I was too late for the Second World War, and I'm too early for the Third World War. But I did feel that there were some things I wanted to clarify and to say. And I also felt that I speak to a lot of people about things like policy and strategy and planning and operations, and we often talk about the modalities of that, the frameworks we all like to apply. And my own experience is that whilst they're useful, they're almost never actually employed. It's too difficult in the way that we deployed into Bosnia or Iraq or Afghanistan. And I felt there was something to be said in writing down just how chaotic it was, and also some of the realities of a military deployment, which are far from being terribly martial. And then the second thing I was wrestling with by then was the afterlife. I've been in the afterlife now this is year 8, since 2016, and I'm trying to be a captain of industry. It's basically been a disaster. And I wanted...
Very modest.
No, I mean, I can honestly say, since the day I left full-time uniform service, I have never had a proper job full-time. Just not happened. So I've had to reinvent myself. And I was struck with the contrasts and the similarities between a life in uniform and a life as essentially a jobbing mercenary, which is what I ended up being. And then I thought, maybe if I could write that down well enough and make it engaging for a broad audience, I'd interested more people in defence, might even amuse them a little bit. And maybe I could replace my strimmer, which is just broken.
That is the aim of today, by the way. What I loved about the book, it covers a lot of very serious and profound ideas about war, and we'll get onto those soon, I promise. But it's also very witty and unexpected in that sort of most people who write about war do it in a slightly grand and pompous way, whereas you never shy away from addressing the mundane realities of what it's like to go to war. I mean, just give people a sense of some of the things they should expect.
So I'm sorry to say this, but one of the common themes from setting up the deployment in Bosnia in 1992 under John Major, and then going into Afghanistan at a week's notice at Christmas 2001, and then into Iraq second on in 2003, is that we wanted to talk about deploying the force and missions and tasks and strategy and plans and logistics, but actually our greatest struggle was we needed loos in the water, without which nothing could happen. If you have 100 soldiers in a confined space and you feed them, and they do want to be fed, then 24 hours later, you're going to have to do what you've got to do. And this drove many aspects of the deployment beyond any thought of any policy or strategy.
You don't get that anywhere else. And just because war is such an odd mix of the sublime and the ridiculous, once you've dealt with the loos, there are also really poignant moments where, for all the plans and all the strategy, the soldier sort of encounters the real people whose lives are going to be shaped by the war. Tell us a bit about one of the incidents in the Balkans and how it shaped the way you view war.
Yes, it was a seminal moment in my life and my military career. And interestingly enough, I've not had that conversation really since then until this week in the context of Gaza. So we were sent to the Balkans because something had to be done. And the something that was to be done was to deliver humanitarian aid, so essentially food and blankets, to the population of Bosnia as the war went on around them. And we were not to engage in the war. We moved around it and through it and could protect ourselves, but nobody else. And I went at that with a certain nobility that, okay, we can help some people who would otherwise starve or freeze. That feels like a good thing to do. And we, despite having to make it up as we went along, struggling with Whitehall's demands for sexy pictures and of tanks, and the reality was we needed to build a road or they just get stuck. I was standing on a bridge in Mostar, the bridge that subsequently was demolished, in my blue UN beret, and I was engaged in a little bit of military tourism because having a quiet day. And Mostar had been taken to pieces by the fight between the Bosnian people and the Croats, mostly, with the Serbs helping us along in the margins. I was feeling quite pleased with myself, and a very attractive young lady of about my age stopped me on the bridge and said, what are you doing here? And I trotted out the lines I know I was meant to say. We're here to support the delivery of humanitarian aid, da, 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 da. And she said, well, I wish you'd just go home. Okay. And she said, why are you come here with all these tanks? And they meant warrior armored vehicles. And you have all this military power, you represent a great country. And yet all you're doing is fattening us up to be killed tomorrow. And she said, essentially, we were either guilty of omission or commission. We either had capability and we had decided not to use it to save them from the fighting, or we had capability and we were just incompetent. And either way, we were watching them lose their homes, their communities, their livelihoods, and they weren't that thrilled with being fattened up today to be shot tomorrow. And I then had that conversation this week with a journalist or two about the aid effort in Gaza, and I recognized the dilemma. You're between a rock and a hard place. I resolved never to do that again.
And it sort of goes to the heart of a lot of the debate around responsibility to protect and how we approach a lot of really difficult situations in the world. You write in the book about your experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq, two of the biggest wars this country's been involved in recent history. How would you say what were the similarities and what were the differences for you?
So I tend now to draw the contrast between Iraq and Afghanistan and what is now facing us. It's a stronger contrast. But in both cases, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we were dispatched to conduct what is, by any standards, a discretionary intervention. That intervention didn't require the mobilization of UK society or industry. It didn't touch daily life at home. The homeland just went about its business in the normal way, and the operations were bounded by cost and time and risk. And our enemies in both cases didn't have air forces or ballistic missiles. There were some really sharp encounters, and soldiers were killed and wounded, and for everyone at that low tactical level, pretty sharp business. And the other common thread from both operations is strategically, it's hard to describe them as resounding successes. And in both cases, I now can explain why that is so. And I understood it at the time, but at the time I was required to work through it. So we did. The challenge is that those essentially dominated almost 2 decades of UK military land intervention. And it's created an army that was used to the idea of discretionary intervention and not used to the idea of having to deal with the sort of contest we saw in the Cold War. And the reason I draw the differences now is that the army I spent most of my adult life attached to thrived on these sorts of interventions and was reduced in size and scale and capability because the country didn't face any existential threat. And that's the army we have today. It's essentially not in great shape. And the challenge it's beginning to face is more familiar to the Cold War challenge of potentially existential military threat, the sort of thing you see in Ukraine. And I think that gap is enormous, and I worry a lot that we're moving so slowly to close the gap.
There's so much to unpack there. Firstly, I mean, in the context of what's happening now, in the last few weeks, we've sort of had a rush to the microphones by politicians of every stripe wanting to talk about defence and security. Just from your last point, do you feel this is something you've been warning about for a very long time, very publicly? Do you feel that politics is finally waking up to the threat, and is enough being done yet?
So you're true, this has been a long-term conversation, and one of the things I recognise and I deeply regret is that for certainly the last maybe 10 years in uniform and the 8 years that have passed since, I have written, spoken, lobbied, argued for the UK and our allies to recognise how the world is changing and to prepare for it. And even as the MOD Ops Director, where I felt it was my duty, and this is more than 10 years ago, to raise the challenge that Russia was beginning to present us, and it was exhibited eventually in the invasion in Crimea. The answer from my policy colleagues was there was no appetite to consider this, either amongst officials or ministers. And somebody actually said, and you must realise, in that way, that people do say when they're patronising you, and you must realise that if we did this work, we would come to some conclusions, and they would be very expensive. Yeah, and so here we are, many years later, and I characterise the current debate about defence and security as the early stages of waking up, and it seems to me the common line across our Parliament now is to say this world we live in, it's really dangerous and challenging, and we can't afford to ignore it. And we must mobilise. And then the second sentence is, but given the state of our economy, we can't afford to do anything about it. So somehow our defence and security is unaffordably unaffordable. And that's merely dodging the question, the hard decisions that will have to come about revitalising UK defence as part of NATO in a world where the challenge is much greater, set by Russia, and who knows where the world goes in the future, but Russia is the clear and present challenge right now. In circumstances where our armed forces are at the bottom of a trajectory of decline, which for explicable but no longer tolerable reasons we followed since 1989, so the gap has got bigger and is significant. And in a setting where our default response is, well, we'll ask the American taxpayer to pay a bit more, pay 70% of NATO. America has been saying for more than 10 years that we need to hold up our end of the log. As a chief on a combined chiefs visit in Washington, the then Vice President Biden broke into our program to tell us to hold up our end of the log because he couldn't explain to the US taxpayer while they were spending all this money on European defence, which meant that they weren't spending it on their own health and roads and education, as if they were ever actually going to do that, in a setting where the Europe that had been broken in 1947 now had an economy valued at about $17.5 trillion a year. That just didn't work. So whatever the outcome of the election in the US this year, they're going to do less over time. And that's the peril. And we've said we must go back to deterrence by denial. And yet we are moving terribly slowly to pay our part of that bill.
It's always so reassuring to hear how we're governed. If you could, as you pointed out, you do have some free time on your hands at the moment. If you could work out a plan for what we need to do most urgently to fix the problem, where would you begin? What are the first 3 or 4 things that we should be doing to make ourselves a competitor?
So slightly more than 2 or 3 or 4 things. So the first thing is...
As many as you like.
...is to recognise that the current armed forces...
Somebody here is taking notes.
Yeah. So the current armed forces, the Navy and the Army in the UK's case, have got some good equipment, but in terribly small numbers, and they lack resilience in people, spares, equipment and training. So there are some things you can do really quickly. You can invest money in training, that's cash. And there's some things that will take longer, cranking up industry so that you can produce a more resilient force. The army is in a poorer state, and this is because the government decided in 2021, as a matter of policy, to delay recapitalizing the army from the 1990s until the back end of this decade. And then there was a war in Ukraine. That position hasn't changed. So we probably need to bring that planning forward. So the first thing is just it needs a bung of money in cash and with industry to make more ammunition faster and more spare parts and more equipment. But it's not where this really goes. So where this really goes is that we're in the foothills of the greatest transformation of how you do defense, how you make an Army, Navy, Air Force, Space, SF, and glue it all together for 150 years, in the way that the digital age is changing how you equip, how you organize, and how you operate. And this is about cloud and space and, of course, artificial intelligence and robotics and autonomy and bioscience in combination. And the winners of that competition will restore a competitive edge in defense. And I want that to be NATO in terms of this difficult conversation we're having with Russia, and in the longer term in a difficult conversation about how our world is going to work. And I would argue works on the edge of extinction if we get it wrong. But there's more to it than that. So moving down this transformative path restores the competitive edge, but it's also going to make the price of defense more sustainable. Because if you buy more autonomous platforms with no people in them, then they're cheaper to buy and they don't feel the need to train. They don't wear themselves out training. They don't want weekends off. And they don't need quarters, and robots don't need pensions, which is a big deal for defence. And if the UK led this path, which it's perfectly capable of doing, given the intellectual power in our armed forces and our industry, then we could rekindle export-driven growth amongst our allies and partners. So what's not to like? And both of those important things, the refitting because the shelves are bare now, and the driving forward on the transformation which is us, and neither of those things are currently connected to either politics or civil society. And the armed forces, because they're hierarchical and a bit conservative, they aren't naturally going to do this at the pace they need to without a massive boot up the backside.
Which is what he's here to provide. You talked there about the sort of things we need to be investing in terms of, you've got to be thinking about cloud and bioscience. This is something you've written about a lot in the essays you did for Global Strategy Forum, but also in the book. Just for people here, paint a picture of what the war of the future will look like so that they can understand how all of those elements would come together, or why they're such an important investment now.
So I think it's a mixture of the old and the new, and I am very disparaging about anyone who ever thinks there's a silver bullet. So we were told for some years in the second decade of this century by ministers and officials and the odd misplaced military thinker that we don't need to worry about shot and shell anymore, because if we ever had to fight, it would all be cyber, and we get some ministers to do some furious tweeting, and it would make all the difference. And what we've been reminded by the war in Ukraine is a reminder of the true nature of war, this existential, unbounded, feral, dangerous, irrational, and usually, well, not usually, nearly always disappointing and unsatisfactory business. Not changed during the path of Homo sapiens leadership of this planet. So that's not changed. But how war is fought changes all the time. And as we've seen in Ukraine, big wars where you're fighting for the survival of your state and your friends' states, are fought, won, and lost by the mobilization of civil society and industry, with the armed forces playing a sort of cadre role. And in many cases, the regular armed forces don't survive the first 6 months, and are then succeeded by people who are adapting to learn to fight the war that you are actually faced with. In the case of Ukraine, 800,000 people in uniform, probably 700,000 of them were civilians in January 2022. And they're going to lose about another 50,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and injured, and taken prisoner for every year that they continue to fight. So that's a big deal. But the transformation is therefore going to be a mixture of things that are familiar. If you're fighting for terrain, it's dominated by artillery. It's just better artillery, some of which can now be very precise, which means there will be armoured vehicles and people will dig trenches. And if we thought that had gone away, no, it hasn't. It's part of how you fight for territory. And then there's a whole array of other things. And I would say the big handfuls of this are the place that you fight, the battle space, is now transparent from space and from open source data. So you can't form an army, navy, or air force and sneak it across the world to try and surprise anybody, because they see it from the moment you open that garage door at home. And we watched the Russian invasion form up for months. And we knew from intelligence that the invasion was going to occur. Some governments just chose not to believe their own data, or the data they were presented with. So it's transparent. Secondly, the advent of precision weapons, so missiles, in attack and defense, are succeeding the primacy of those iconic platforms we still think about: ships, tanks, aircraft, big bases, large headquarters in harm's way. This is a process, not an event. But if you look at the decision just recently to withdraw the American Abrams tanks in Ukraine from the frontline duty they were, because they're not surviving an encounter with a drone, you can see that we're in a process of evolution, and it will be a process of evolution. And there are two things that are really going to dominate the shape of future armed forces. The first is they will be built on a digital backbone of cloud, with data managed by artificial intelligence, with really robust, secure networks that connect everything up, into which you will plug the platforms that you buy. And that's the complete inversion of where you used to spend all your money on a destroyer, a plane, or a tank. And then if you had any change left, you might put a radio in it. That didn't work well. That's just not going to be. So the digital backbone is going to give people the edge that glues everything together. And then there's this phenomenal evolution of navies, armies, air forces, and space capability, from essentially platforms with people on them to an evolving manned, unmanned, and autonomous mix. And it's the autonomous thing that's going to restore mass and effectiveness at a sustainable price. And you can see in our own Air Force now, in the GCAP program, good news, they are talking about spending money on the autonomous women. Bad news, for reasons I cannot fathom, they still want to put a human being in the sky when that human being is never going to look out of the window and is just looking at instruments, and they should look at them on the ground and produce machines that can operate way beyond the tolerance of the human frame. Maybe that's because air forces tend to be run by people who fly. We need to unpick that. For the Navy, they're beginning to invest in surface vessels, and you can see the damage Ukraine has done to the Russian Black Sea fleet with maritime drones on the surface and underneath it. That's the future of naval warfare. If we had First Sea Lord and Andy Burns, the fleet commander, in here, they would say, absolutely, just give me the money to do it. And they will move down that path. So we won't spend £1.2 billion on a frigate to get 35 missiles to the right place on the planet. There'll be better ways of spending that money to get more missiles to more places. And same for the army, where a tank turns up with people in it. In the future, that tank will turn up, but in front of it, there'll be 2 or 3 more with no people in it, and they are cooperating thanks to the miracle of autonomy, robotics, AI, and cloud-based data. And that's the way that the West can restore its defensive edge, if it chooses to. And the simple fact is, right now, other people in the world who may not have our best interests in heart are likely to own the key technology before we do. And that's our own fault.
So obviously there's a real need to push towards the autonomous aspect of this.
Yeah.
But as you say, any future war inevitably involves people, and the regular forces don't last long. It will rely on a civilian effort. What did you make of the recent debate around conscription, national service? Should we be thinking about that?
So I think that reflected a lack of, I'm trying not to use the word ignorance, a lack of familiarity with how big wars work. So we're really talking about mobilization. So I've spoken recently to some young journalists who were astonished, even outraged, at the idea that if there was a war between NATO and Russia, that this would not be fought exclusively by the tiny threadbare armed forces that we have in some remote way, and that the UK homeland would be off the pitch and immune, because that's the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan. But as I say, big wars, fought, won and lost by civil society mobilized. And if you follow the Ukrainian experience, it's quite instructive. So they had quite a big regular army, and they had a big reserve in February 22 because they could see what was going to come. And now they are 4 times bigger, and they mobilized volunteers. The odd thing that Ukraine had to do is they mobilized their dads. Average age in the front line is 43, because they are the oldest population in Europe, and they've been trying to protect what I'm going to very crudely call their breeding stock, the 20-somethings. And now they've run out of volunteers, and they're having to conscript down to about 25. So when we talk about the mobilization of civil society, it's a recognition that war between states is a whole of society effort, and we haven't really had to think about that since the 1980s. And when you mobilize, of course, you'll be looking for volunteers first, better than 10 press men. But if it doesn't go well, or it goes on for a long time, just as we have found in this country in the First and Second World War, and we would find in the Third World War, you'll have to conscript. And that's where Ukraine is now, and it's where Russia is now. And so no one is talking about, well, we need to conscript now. That's not like running a summer camp to give people a taste of army life, which is another completely different proposition.
Would that help?
Well,
if
so I think it might help for
a
different reason.
They're getting sort of, a month's training before they're on the front line. Would it help to have people skilled up?
So I think there's 2 things here. One is, in the world we live in, great power confrontation, we are going to have to reset national resilience. And there's a physical, shelters and food distribution thing to that. There's a digital bit, and there's a massive cognitive piece that we all carry phones, and that means we are not immune to disinformation or misinformation. So resetting resilience for government, enterprises, institutions and citizens becomes important, and our setting for the last 30 years is to think we didn't need to be resilient, we could do just in time, and we could outsource everything to be made in China and shipped around the world, and we could buy our energy cheaply somewhere else in the world. That was all fine. We're in a different place right now. But the boot camp thing, or the summer experience, I think plays to a recognition that somehow we have managed to grow a generation of young adults, I think I'm meant to call them Gen Z or after, 16 to 24-year-olds, who largely because of the advent of the smartphone and the way that we live, I'm going to describe it as in an age of decadence. It's very comfortable, and we can worry about things that I struggle to really worry, small things in the scale of human horror. We want to devote all our energy to arguing about, I am not going to give you a list because I know it gets me into trouble every time. But, so young adults who are not resilient, who believe that they are entitled to prosperity and comfort, and entitled to be immune to harm, and where Wi-Fi is a human right. And if anything bad happens, it's either their parents' fault or the government will sort it out. And they are a long walk away from a world where in a confrontation with a power like Russia, they are capable of exercising that conflict through a direct assault on daily life. So that's cyber on infrastructure, cyber interventions in banking and food and all of those things. So how does Generation Z get on when it turns on the tap in the morning when it gets out of bed and nothing comes out, or there's no power, or their phone doesn't work? Well, they need to know that can happen in this world. And I have ambitions to run things like resilience training in every university in this country. Not going very quickly, but that's the kind of thing we need to think about.
I do want to try and get to as many questions as possible, so do start putting your hands up. Already so much demand. We'll start at the back so that we can get a microphone to you faster. And if you're watching online, do send in your questions, and we'll try and cover some of those too. If you could just introduce yourself before you ask a question.
David de Freitas. One thing we have in common is that we're both members of the Honourable Artillery Company. I was wondering what it was that made you decide you would like to become Colonel Commandant, And is that an example of your legendary sense of humour?
Well, the first thing, it was an invitation I couldn't refuse, trending an order. And the second reason is, and the Honourable Artillery Company happens to be, and I'm biased, but it's equally true, one of the leading elements of the reserve forces. And I am a champion of reserve forces. In today's army, it's about 72,000 regulars and about 27,000 reservists. In 1939, there were about 220,000 regulars and there were 800,000 reservists.
Wow.
By 1943, the British Army was 2.9 million. It could never get any bigger. And they were all civilians. So the post-Cold War era has led us to a place where you can use, frankly, quite bijou armed forces of regular people to do Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Balkans. And it doesn't trouble the reserve, which we then largely and unfortunately dismantled, and it doesn't trouble civil society. The world we live in now, it is absolute madness to think you should spend your money on a big regular army, because so much of what an army needs to do occasionally is better done by a healthy, vibrant, well-led, well-equipped, well-trained reserve. And the HAC is top of the list to do that kind of thing. And our neglect of the reserve and our challenge in making it part of the conversation about defence transformation is just poor thinking. And I'm sure we'll correct a historical aberration shortly.
If we get round to the front.
John Wilson, I was conscripted in the 1950s, and it was 2 years of my life completely wasted. I can tell you some very bad tales about conscription. My question simply, General, and there's so many things that you've raised that are of great interest to us all, is why or should the Ukrainians conscript their women? They're 50% of the population. As you know, they have a shortage of troops. During the Second World War, through which I lived, in December 1941, the British brought in a conscription act for women.
Yes, it's a vibrant debate in Ukraine. The reasons for not doing it in Ukraine are cultural. There are actually an awful lot of women engaged in supporting the Ukrainian armed forces. Some of the engineering around drone technology, for example, is led by women. In this country, there's no conception that if you introduce conscription, it wouldn't be for, I'm going to say this word, both sexes, because they would expect to be there in the way that the Army, Navy, and Air Force, are populated by men and women now in ways that were unthinkable in the 1980s. After all, that's where at least half the talent and energy and resilience lies, and quite a lot of the business of fighting is done sitting down, and that there is only a tiny element where the advantage is someone who is the size of a prop forward, a male prop forward, and we should recognise that those jobs do exist. But I mean, look at the number of women who are commanding regiments, and the Army Deputy CGS for the first time is a lady 3-star general. Sharp as a sharp thing.
Another question at the front. We'll work over to that side.
Thank you. Ali Bahajub, North-South Publications. As a military expert, what is your take on the military situation at the moment in Gaza? And also, a lot of military observers believe that future warfare will actually be controlled more by artificial intelligence than boots on the ground. Thank you. So
they're connected. My view on the war in Gaza as a military guy has not changed since the first day of the intervention by the IDF. It is not possible to apply military force in a way that destroys an idea or an organization like Hamas. You can give it quite a thumping. You can remove the physical things, so tunnels, weapon stocks, headquarters, its structure. That's pretty much being done. And the target in Rafah is 3 battalions of Hamas, but Hamas is back in northern Gaza. So there was never a military outcome from this option that did any more than reduce Hamas. That does not preclude its reinvention or its re-equipment. So the strategic outcome from this intervention was quite hard to spot. And I think everyone is struggling. And I saw some conversations today about a third-party force in Gaza. Well, that's the sort of conversation where I think we'll spend more time. And your point on artificial intelligence is a really key one, because we already use artificial intelligence in ways that some key equipments work. Because if you don't, you die. No human can work as quickly as AI does in identifying a threat, applying a missile to it, and that missile doing its job in attack and defense. It's going to be key to how you do intelligence well, how you make command decisions, how you issue direction, how you coordinate operations, and how you do logistics. The important thing is that this has to be artificial intelligence in support of the human commander and staff officer. And one of the challenges there is humans don't really know how the AI works, and AI is capable of hallucinating because of the way that AI works. So we're on a steep learning curve. Where I think there is great jeopardy is where you develop an AI system, particularly to do with targeting, and you can give it some parameters, and it will then identify targets. What you cannot do is then cede the decision to apply lethal force to the program, because it will do daft things, and we may have seen some signs of that. And I mentioned this business of being on the edge of extinction, so allow me a mild excursion here. So one of the leadership challenges of today is that we have trending 8 billion people on the planet, and all of us are capable of having things in our head, whether it's faith or political theory or some other view of how the world works. We are inclined to think that thing in our head, which doesn't exist in the real world, is eternal, universal, and exclusive. And we're prepared to fight to the death from it. And you see that in Gaza, you see that in Ukraine, you see it in many other settings. So we're in a world where we're prepared to fight for the death of the things that we believe that exist in our head. We've had nuclear weapons before, but now we're going to have AI. So we're about to be liable to fight for the death with weapons we can't keep up with, we may not understand, and possibly we can't control. For the first time in human history, we're going to do that on a planet which can't cope with us in the way that we've abused it in the past. So resources are finite. And in the middle of it is you and I. And as you know, we are quite fallible. You know, we invented the iPhone, we went to the moon, but we do Morris dancing. You know, we're just not that rational. So how is it that, given that range of problems I've described, we're going to find the leadership and the followership to take really hard decisions? We talked about defense spending. Have less health and education because you need to reset defense. Russia does it by diktat, 6% this year. We can't have that debate, apparently. And above all of that, how can we persuade ourselves to forego the things we like now, whether it's experiences or consumption, in order to assure our security and longevity in the future? And if I ask many audiences to vote on that proposition, and the proposition is, can we do that, or will we fail, and 100 years from now, the world will be run by the rats and the ants? I generally get about a 50-50 vote on it.
We're in so much trouble. Could we start from the back and work up?
Thank you very much for your talk. I do have a background in studying a master's in diplomacy. So I'd wonder, like, given this really multifaceted idea or notion of threat, how would you say, like, the military, like, what role does the military play in formulating national security and also foreign policy with the civilian government?
This is an excellent question. I am absolutely wedded to the idea that you should never let the military choose which wars to fight, or cede to them total control over how they fight them. Because wars are fought, won and lost by civil society, and the military are an instrument. And there is a military doctrinal point, which is people like me like to be given an instruction to invade this country or deliver that outcome, and we think we just should be left to get on with it and report success at the end. And And maybe that worked a couple of hundred years ago where communications were terrible. But one of the key lessons I learned, even way back in Bosnia in the 90s, is I may be conducting an operation, but there are some poor politician, and I respect all politicians for what they volunteer for. I'm just not going to do it myself. But some poor politician has to stand up in Parliament and explain why I did what I did. And I am therefore subordinate to civil control. The other side of that, and this is something that I bumped into in my later years of service, is because of the difficulties we encountered in Iraq and Afghanistan, frankly, the lack of success. I was working for politicians who were disappointed in having to deal with that, but felt that we had offered an outcome that we couldn't guarantee, which is true. And therefore, in conversations about defense and security and resetting to deterrence by denial, I felt that the military voice was being diminished, and there were people who really didn't know about war and really didn't know about how you do military capability, felt that somehow they would make those judgments for us, and they just produced terrible judgments. So there's a balance to be struck. So soldiers like me have to find our place, a subordinate place, in a complex discussion about fusing all levers of power. And the bit that we take charge of is pretty narrow and tactical, in my view.
We'll go to the question over there, but before we do, just following on from that, you're talking about the nexus between politicians and the military. We've got a question that's come in online from Christopher Samuel, who says the UK is walking into imminent danger. The public are totally unaware of the need to have the capability to protect. UK defence is measured in financial terms and not professional capability. How can you make the population aware of the true position when the MOD are not allowed to speak honestly about the reality, and as very few politicians want to until they think there are some votes in it?
So I think that problem has got a little easier. I mean, Grant Shapps and others have said we're pre-war and then not done very much about it. The Prime Minister talked about putting defence industry on a war footing, and almost nothing is going to happen about that right now. However, the point I draw from many roles is it doesn't matter what I say. I talk to audience like this, the things I write, the things I might provoke, the things I might get other people to say. I don't believe I've hardly shifted the needle at all in either politics or civil society.
I wouldn't say that.
Well, you're very kind, but honestly, we wouldn't be having this conversation if I'm sure to be mounting a coup, which is sometimes attractive.
It's not off the cards.
So I haven't given up, but I'm resigned to this not working. And the answer, I believe, and we've talked a little about it in other settings, is the thing that moves politics is when civil society says, we need you to do this. We've got to do better than politicians waiting to be told what to do by civil society because they get voted. But I understand if a politician does something that civil society doesn't want, then that's electoral suicide. So how we break into that is a challenge. And my approach to this is I have to move civil society and politics by harnessing the power of entertainment. And it would be by running a film or a box set that told the story of what World War III looks like in all its dimensions, in a way that captures the popular imagination and makes them think, well, actually, that could matter. And clearly that would have to be wrapped up, there's got to be some massive love story in there and all of that, all that kind of stuff, which I'm not good at that. We need the storytellers to do that. But if you can't do it, as it were, through official channels, if we did it through entertainment, could we get 15, 20 million people in the UK to watch this thing once a week and then talk about it, and then for their politicians to think, oh, hang on a minute, we're all heading in the same direction now, that might move the needle. That seems to me a better outcome than the normal British habit of waiting for a disaster and then trying to pick ourselves out of the ashes.
You sort of want a post office scandal moment.
That's a very good example, yeah.
Question about
James Kidner, originally from the Foreign Office, then in the much more foreign world of technology, where, again, you're being a bit Eeyore-ish about your contributions, Richard, because you were an advisor to the company that I was working for, and you made an enormous difference there, as you are continuing to make in other ones too. This has been a real treat. It's a fascinating book, and we must all buy it. I already have, so you can sign it later. And it's extraordinary to have the privilege of a conversation about such serious and terrifying issues with a light-hearted sort of icing that makes it palatable. You've sort of answered my question in your last response, and it's again about this moral challenge of getting a society to take seriously the threat that it faces. One of the sort of less known stories of late 1939 is that between September and December that year, about 300,000 pets were destroyed on government orders because we had got hungry in the First World War and we knew we were going to get hungry in the war that was coming. And so people with dogs that weren't working dogs had to have them either licensed or put down. And I just find it inconceivable that a government these days could go out and tell people that they had to have all their pets put down because we were at risk of getting hungry. You've sort of answered with the idea of a Netflix series that gets us excited about all this, but if you could wave your wand over one thing that would energize the British public to take more seriously the business of the imminent threat that the last question addressed, what would it be?
So I would adopt the Swedish approach. If I could do one thing, I would mandate that to start with, every young person, every student was required to undertake a week's resilience training where these things were aired, and they came away with key life skills in what to do when there's no water, emergency first aid, self-protection, all of those things. Other countries are starting to do that. And it might be possible. I would then want that to extend into the corporate space, so adults that were not so young had the same benefit, because I think it's only by education and training that we can inculcate a collective resilience from the citizen through institutions to government that mean that bit of deterrence, which is resilience, comes back into balance.
question at the front. Yeah.
My name is John Dobson. I write for the Indian Sunday Guardian. Last July, I happened to be on the edge of Gaza Strip talking to IDF forces who were actually manning the Iron Dome system that you know about. One thing that came across very clearly to me was the quality of the people. As you know, the Israeli model is to have 3 years for men and 2 years for women in conscription. Now, I know they have to do it, and we probably don't have to do it now, but what I saw in front of me were really high-quality young people who have been through a process that you will know about. And I'm just wondering whether or not you would support a sort of Israeli model for this country, whereby we do much the same thing and produce quality people for industry afterwards.
So I think that our settings are different, and our numbers are really different. So I would tackle that in a different way. I would say that the defence and security and prosperity of the United Kingdom depends on a fusion of the regular armed forces, the reserve, some of whom want to come into the reserve and do the thing they don't do at work, so involving helmets and rifles, and others come into the military to do the thing they do at work. So they're the cyber experts and the information experts, so regular reserve, but then industry and civil servant and civil society. So and for me, the key to this is the expansion of the reserve, because a reserve is a way in which really talented people who have thriving civilian careers can devote some time for money in the protection of their state, and they bring all that innovation and energy into a much more complex military act now. And you could do that in a lot more than the military. You could do it in GCHQ and in intelligence, things like that. That's essentially a halfway house to where mobilization takes you. And one of the advantages for the armed forces of mobilization is some of the very best people who aren't in the military come into the military, and they then lead the functions like intelligence and logistics that they do to a globally competitive standard in their ordinary lives. All of that is possible as part of a new discussion between government and the population, which we're not having at the minute.
We'll try and get as many as possible. Could we get one there and then over here? We'll try and get them all in before 2.
Richard Barrons, former French military liaison officer and currently advisor, digital engagement advisor, both to the NHS and to different pharma companies. Now, given the parallel requirement for one resource is a new thinking in defence, do you feel that, I mean, say in the case of the NHS, there's recognition probably with leaders, government ministers, that digital transformation is necessary to avert the collapse of the system going forward, as well as money. Do you think, particularly with the likelihood of a change of ministerial outlook in a potential new government, do you think it's not likely for the UK to actually move to that recognition for defence and security?
So one of the ways I make myself continually unpopular is to argue that you could fix defence spending from the shavings of NHS reform by going to a different model and removing the inefficiencies of what I understand has eclipsed the Church of England as our national religion. That's unpopular, but there is a whole of government approach to defence of which that would be part. The second part of your question is we are going to have an election, and if there were to be a change of government, would a new administration think in this way? And my current understanding is no, for 2 reasons. One is because they don't sense that's how they get elected, and 2 is there simply isn't the depth or competence in today's opposition to frame this kind of thinking, and because it's not a priority, it's probably not happening. And therefore, in my darker moments, I sense we might have an election. We'll get a sense of a fresh start, and 6 months down the road, we'll be wrestling with things pretty much as we're wrestling now. And then, unless we could find a way out of that through intellect and analysis and good policy making, we're then back to, well, when we get thumped, will we be able to get off our knees and recover in the way that we culturally think we're quite good at? And I then have to accept, and when I talk about the nature of war, say to people that there's no guarantee, there's no safety net, there's no immunity to this. You may not choose war, war can choose you. It's a rather trite thing to say. And it may just therefore be that we are the UK and our partners, in a part of our history where we are in decline, and we are going to get done over. And if that happens, it's our own fault.
Colleen Graffi, I'm a law professor with Pepperdine University, and I'm wondering if you have a wish list for outcomes for the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. this summer, in particular, whether NATO, or at least a coalition of the willing, should make the determination to close the skies over Ukraine, Western Ukraine at least, similar to the efforts that were made for Israel against the attack by Iran, an iron dome over Western Ukraine so that Ukraine can build their own defenses, prevent refugee issues, and basically this is the only way to help Ukraine to survive. Thank you.
So my view on Ukraine and NATO, and my wish for the NATO summit, is first of all to recognize that the best possible outcome for NATO and European security is to make sure Ukraine doesn't break this summer, doesn't ever break, and is in the end equipped to come to an outcome on its own terms. That is the cheapest, safest, most secure way of preserving European security, because any outcome that allows Russia to break through brings you to the point you just described. You've got Russian forces that have broken through, heading for the Dnieper River, maybe western Ukraine. At that point, Ukraine will ask for a no-fly zone, which is war with Russia. NATO members on the border will mobilize, and they'll want an Article 5 conversation. That just takes us to a terrible place of a risk of miscalculation and uncontrolled escalation. It is all avoidable if NATO binds in behind Ukraine. And the madness underpins that is Russia is an economy of about $1.7 trillion a year, Europe 17.5 trillion, the US 23 trillion. So we should never be in this position. Very, very small things would have allowed Ukraine to deter a Russian attack. And very, very small movements, but some urgency now would equip them to do better. And that's the first thing. And the second thing is, whatever the outcome of Ukraine, it appears to me that NATO is now locked in a confrontation with a Putin-led Russia, which rests on Mr. Putin's view that he's at war with the West, and his lack of success in Ukraine in comparative terms is because the West is supporting Ukraine, which is bizarre given the conversation we just had. And therefore, whatever the outcome in Ukraine, we are locked in this confrontation with Russia. In our own interest, could we please breathe life into deterrence by denial and reset our defense and security so we are dictating the terms to Russia so that it need never, ever become the war that nobody needs. Deterrence, as we've seen in Ukraine several times now, so much better than fighting. If we had deterred in Ukraine, there wouldn't have been 500,000 casualties on both sides. There wouldn't be a reconstruction bill of $500 billion. There wouldn't have been the destruction of the Ukraine economy, or even the destruction of the Russian economy in the way that it's becoming militarized. So let's do deterrence properly. And in a setting where the US is going to do less, there's a bigger bill coming for Europe. Could we please rise to that challenge?
I'm really sorry, we have completely run out of time, so we're not going to have time for any more questions. You could try and nab Richard on the way out, but also please do buy a copy of the book. He will sign it for you. We were talking earlier, and apparently Liz Truss managed to sell 3,000 copies. Let's see if we can get there by publication date. We're going to be watching the book sales like the country watched the letters, so please make it happen. In the meantime, thank you so much, Richard, for sharing your insights.